He ran 800 acres of northern Ontario timber country for 22 years without keeping a single ledger that balanced to the penny, and he was proud of it. That is what I keep coming back to, not the acreage. Not the money he lost, which was considerable, but pride. The particular bone-deep pride of a man who has done something hard for a long time and decided that the difficulty itself is proof enough that he is doing it right. His name was Callum Strachan. He was 43 years old when Vera Lund arrived at the mill, and he had not asked her to come. I should tell you what the property looked like, because the land matters in a story like this. The Strachan mill sat on the eastern shore of a lake called Osprey, about 60 kilometers north of Sudbury. Not the kind of country that looks beautiful on a postcard. It looks gray in November and gray in March and brilliant for about 6 weeks in between, when the maples go red and the birch goes gold, and the whole thing blazes like something that knows it is about to die. Callum had grown up there. His father had cut the first timber on that land in 1951, and Callum had taken over the operation in 2002, after his father's second heart attack, made it clear the old man was not coming back to the mill floor. For 22 years, Callum ran it the way his father had run it. You harvested what the season gave you. You sold to the contractors who had always bought from you. You paid your men on Friday, and you left the rest alone. The books were kept in a spiral notebook in the top drawer of a desk that had belonged to his father. The columns were in pencil. Sometimes they were in pen, crossed out with pencil. He had 3 permanent employees and a rotation of seasonal workers he pulled from the same 2 families in the area who had worked the property since before Callum could walk. He knew the timber the way you know a place you have moved through your whole life. By feel, by smell, by the sound of a saw hitting a particular density of wood. He did not need a spreadsheet to tell him what was there. That was what he believed. I am not saying he was a foolish man. I am saying he believed this and that for a long time. Nothing happened to contradict him. Vera Lund had been married to a man named Peter Drummond for 11 years. Peter had been Callum's closest friend from the age of 19. The kind of friend who shows up at 2 in the morning when your truck goes into a ditch and doesn't mention it afterward. He had bought a 25% stake in the Strachan operation in 2009. Not because he knew anything about timber, but because Callum had needed a cash infusion after a bad winter and Peter was the only person who offered without conditions. Peter died of a brain aneurysm on a Tuesday morning in March. He had been making coffee. He was 51 years old. Callum drove to Sudbury for the funeral and said almost nothing the entire day. That was how he handled grief. He went quiet and stayed that way until it passed through him, however long that took. He had done it when his father died. He had done it when his marriage ended in 2015. He was good at enduring things alone. What he had not considered was what Peter's death meant legally. The 25% stake did not dissolve with the man. It passed to his estate, which passed to his wife, Vera Drummond. She had kept Lund as a professional name through the marriage. Called Callum 3 weeks after the funeral. She was composed on the phone in a way that Callum found, if he was honest, slightly unsettling. She said she wanted to come up and look at the property. She said she understood the operation was seasonal and she did not want to be in the way, but she felt it was important to understand what she had inherited before making any decisions. Callum said that was fine. He did not mean it to sound cold. It came out cold anyway. The drive from Toronto to Osprey Lake was 4.5 hours. Vera made it alone on a Friday in April, when the last of the snow was still in the shadows of the spruce trees, where the sun could not reach. She was 37 years old. She had short dark hair and a habit of standing still when she was thinking, the way some people go quiet before they speak. She carried a canvas bag that turned out to contain a legal pad, 2 pens, a laptop, and a thermos of tea. She did not bring luggage for more than 2 nights. She ended up staying for 9 days. The first evening was polite and difficult in the way that evenings are when 2 people have grief in common but do not have an easy language for it. Callum made dinner, which was the plain kind: pork chops, boiled potatoes, bread from the bakery in town because he did not bake. Vera ate everything on her plate. She asked him 2 questions about Peter that were the right questions. The ones that let Callum talk about the man rather than the loss, and he found that easier than he expected. She did not ask about the mill that night. She asked to look at it in the morning. In the morning, she came out to the property in rubber boots she had apparently brought specifically for this purpose. And she looked at everything. Not a polite look, the kind of look a person gives to be able to say they looked. She walked the operation from the loading dock to the secondary storage shed to the edge of the cut area, on the north side of the property. She asked the names of the seasonal workers when she met them. She asked Callum what each section of the property was currently producing. Callum answered. He was patient with it. He assumed she was satisfying a reasonable curiosity, and that by the end of the day she would understand that the operation was sound, and she could return to Toronto having done her due diligence. That evening she asked to see the books. He brought her the spiral notebook. He watched her face when she looked at it. She did not say anything. She opened it and read it for a while, and then she asked, very carefully, whether there was a digital version anywhere. There was not, she said. That's all right. She wrote something on her legal pad. She asked if she could take the notebook to the kitchen table and work for a while, and Callum said yes and went to watch the news in the other room and tried not to feel like a man being examined. By 10 o'clock she had found the first problem. She came to the doorway of the sitting room and said, "Callum, I don't want to alarm you, but I'm looking at your supply costs from 2019 to now, and the rate you're paying Hessler & Sons has gone up 41% over 5 years. Is that a contract rate or spot pricing?" Callum said he had always bought from Hessler. They were a local supplier. His father had used them. Vera said, "I understand. But are you pricing it against alternatives?" He said he had not. No. She went back to the table. By midnight she had found 3 more. I want to be fair to Callum here because it would be easy to tell this story as though he were the obstacle and Vera were the solution. That is not exactly what happened. The truth is more complicated and, I think, more interesting. Callum Strachan knew his land. He knew where the timber was healthy and where it needed to rest. He knew which seasonal workers were worth bringing back and which ones were reliable on paper but slow in practice. He knew how to read a sky in October and decide whether to push the last cut or pull the crew. 22 years of that knowledge lived in him in a way that does not translate easily to a spreadsheet column. What he did not know, what he had never looked at squarely, was the financial architecture of his own operation. He knew his revenue in the general sense. He did not know his margin. He had a rough idea of his costs. He did not know where the leaks were. Vera found 4 of them in a single night. The Hessler pricing was one. The second was a maintenance contract on the primary saw equipment that was renewing automatically every year at a rate that had not been renegotiated since 2011. The third was the loading and transport arrangement with a company out of North Bay that was charging 15% above regional market for the same service. The fourth, and this was the one that made Callum sit very still when she showed him, was a timber rights payment that was being collected by a holding company in Ottawa, that Callum had simply assumed was a standard municipal levy. It was not. It was a legacy payment from an agreement his father had made in 1998 and the terms of that agreement had expired in 2014. He had been paying it for 10 years past its legal end date. Vera showed him the documents. She had found them in a folder at the back of the desk drawer, beneath the spiral notebook. She had not gone looking for ammunition. She had simply been thorough. Callum looked at the numbers for a long time. He said quietly, "What does it add up to?" She told him. He did not respond immediately. Outside the window the lake was flat and dark and the treeline on the far side was a black edge against a slightly less black sky. He said, "You found all of this in one evening," she said. "I've been doing financial audits for 12 years, and your books are not complicated. They're just unexamined." That last sentence landed hard, not because she meant it cruelly, she did not, but because it was exact. His books were not complicated, they were unexamined. He had run 800 acres for 22 years on feel and loyalty, and the assumption that because the mill was still standing, everything must be approximately correct. He stood up and went to bed without saying much else. Vera sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning. The next morning was tense in the particular way of mornings, after a person has been shown something true that they were not ready to see. Callum came in early, before she was up, and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the mill and the dock and the gray surface of the water. When Vera came down at 7 he already had the spiral notebook open on the table, and a pen in his hand, which was not something she had seen him do before. He said, "The Hessler contract, can I get out of it?" She sat down across from him and opened her laptop. She said, "I looked at it this morning. You're month to month, you can give 30 days notice," he said. "And the Ottawa payment?" She said, "I'd want a lawyer to confirm it, but based on what I read, yes. The obligation ended in 2014. You're entitled to recover what you've paid since then." He looked at that, he said. "That's a significant amount of money," she said. "It is." He said, "My father would not have paid it knowingly past the term." She said, "No, I don't think he would have. I think it was a clerical habit." The payment was set up automatically and no one looked at the underlying agreement after it was filed. Callum was quiet for a moment, then he said, "And the timber rights assessment on the north section. What did you mean last night when you said it was undervalued?" She turned the laptop toward him. He read what was on the screen. He was quiet again longer this time. He said, "That is a considerable difference," she said. "Yes," he said. "You're telling me I've been sitting on timber that's worth substantially more than I've been treating it as worth." She said, "I'm telling you the market rate for that grade of hardwood in this region is not what you've been pricing against. Either your buyers know that and haven't mentioned it, or the information simply hasn't come your way." He looked out the window at the tree line. He said, "My father sold to Brentworth Lumber for 30 years. I've sold to them since I took over." She said, "I know, and they may be perfectly decent people, but you haven't looked at what they're paying you against what the timber is actually worth on the open market. Those two things should be related. They don't appear to be." He closed the spiral notebook. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "What would you do?" It was not a challenge. It was a genuine question, and Vera recognized the difference. She did not rush to answer it. She said, "I'd start with the 3 things you can change immediately without disrupting the operation. Cancel the Hessler arrangement and get 3 quotes before the month is out. Put the Ottawa payment on hold and have a lawyer send a formal notice. And before this season's timber goes out, get an independent appraisal of the north section hardwood so you have a number in your hand when you talk to Brentworth." He said, "In what order?" She said, "The order I just said them." He almost smiled. Almost. By the 4th day something had shifted, not in the books. That work was ongoing, methodical, occasionally surprising, but in the rhythm of the days. Callum had started asking her to walk the property with him in the mornings. Not to show her things in the way he had the first morning. The polite tour, the assumed expertise. He was asking her to look at things with him. There was a difference. He showed her the north section timber she had flagged in the records. She walked among the trees and said almost nothing for 10 minutes, and he did not fill the silence which told her something about him she had not expected. Then she said, "How long has this section been resting?" He said, 7 years, that part, the eastern edge about 4. She said, "And you've never had it formally assessed?" He said, "My father never did." She said, "That's not what I asked." He said, "No, I haven't." She wrote something in the notebook she had started carrying. She said, "I'm not a forester, but even I can see this is healthy timber. You should know what it's worth from someone who is." He looked up into the canopy. He said, "My father knew this section. He used to say you could feel the difference in a stand that's been let alone long enough." Vera said, "He was probably right. I just want to make sure someone has turned that feeling into a number." It was not until that evening, when Callum was cooking and Vera was at the table working, that she said something she had been turning over for several days. She said, "Can I ask you something personal?" He said. "You can ask," she said. "When you look at the operation, what are you afraid of changing?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "My father built this, not just the physical structure, the relationships, the doing business. If I change who we buy from and who we sell to and how we price, at some point it stops being his operation and becomes something else," Vera said. "Or it becomes yours." He did not answer that directly, but she noticed that he did not dismiss it either. On the 6th day, a man named Jerry Hessler drove up to the mill in a truck and asked to speak with Callum. His family's supply company had received a request for quotation from Callum the previous afternoon, the first one Callum had sent in 22 years. Alongside 2 requests to competing suppliers. Jerry was not angry. He was, if anything, slightly uncomfortable, the way a person is when they suddenly have to justify something they have been comfortable with for a long time. Callum introduced Vera as his business partner, which was not a word either of them had used before that moment. Vera did not react to it. The conversation between Callum and Jerry lasted about 40 minutes. Callum was not confrontational. He had a number. The number Vera had found by pricing the same materials from the other 2 suppliers. And he put it on the table without drama. He said he had been with Hessler for 22 years and he valued the relationship, and he was not interested in switching to a cheaper source simply because it was cheaper. But he said, "This number has to be closer to this other number or I have to make a business decision." Jerry looked at the numbers. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I can get to within 8%. Callum looked at Vera. She gave a very small nod. Callum said, "Then let's talk about what that looks like." After Jerry left, Vera poured them both coffee and said, "You didn't have to introduce me as a business partner." Callum said, "What would you have had me say?" She said, "I don't know. I just noticed you said it." He said, "It seemed accurate." She did not push it further. Neither did he. The lawyer Vera contacted in Sudbury confirmed the Ottawa payment situation within 40. The holding company, a real estate and land management firm whose principals had changed hands twice since the original agreement, had no legal basis for continued collection. The overpayments since 2014 amounted to a number that made Callum stand very still for a second time. He said, "That money belongs to the operation." Vera said, "It does." He said, "My father would have." He started it again. "He would have wanted to know." Vera said, "I think he would have." The independent forestry assessor came out on the 7th day. Vera had located him through the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources database. He was thorough and unimpressed by both of them, which was the correct quality in a man doing that kind of work. He walked the north section for 3 hours and produced a written preliminary assessment the following morning. The number for the mature hardwood on the north section was significantly higher than what Callum had been treating it as worth. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. "Callum, read the assessment twice," he said. "Brentworth is going to want to talk." Vera said, "Yes, you should let them come to you." He said, "That is not how I have ever done business." She said, "I know, but you have something they want and now you have a document that tells you exactly what it's worth. You don't have to go to them, they'll come." He was quiet. Then he said, "Do you want to be in that meeting?" She said. "If you want me there, yes." He said, "I want you there. I have told this story the way I heard it, which is not always the same as the way it happened. I was not at the kitchen table when Vera found the first problem in the books. I was not on the mill floor when Callum introduced her as his business partner to a man he had bought materials from for more than 2 decades. But I know how stories like this tend to move, because I have heard enough of them. There is a point, usually somewhere in the middle, when the practical business of correcting things is well underway, and the emotional reckoning has not quite arrived yet. When the two people at the center of the story have to decide what they are to each other. Not what they will become, just what they already are, set against the fact that they cannot easily go back to being strangers. For Callum and Vera, I think that point was the 8th evening, when the work was mostly done, and the assessor had gone home, and the Brentworth meeting was scheduled for the following week. They had eaten dinner without talking very much, which had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere around the 5th day and had become something else. The particular ease of two people who have been in close quarters over a difficult problem and have learned each other's pace. Callum said at some point in the evening, "You didn't have to stay this long," Vera said. "The work took this long," he said. "You could have told me what to look for and left me to it," she said. "You could have told me to send a proxy and not come yourself," he said. "That's true," she said. "So we both stayed," he said. "We both stayed." There was a pause. Outside, the lake was doing what the lake always did at that hour, which was go dark and flat and slightly silver, and the loons had been calling since before dinner. Vera said, "I need to go back to Toronto at the end of the week. I have a client audit on Monday." He said, "I know," she said, "but, that makes sense." He said, "It makes sense," she said, "not just for the operation." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I understand what you mean," she said, "I figured you did." Vera Lund came back to Osprey Lake in June, and in September, and in December for the first time, when the lake froze and the mill was quiet, and Callum showed her the property the way it looked in winter. Which is the truest way to see a piece of Northern Ontario land, stripped down without the flattery of green or color, just the structure of things. She had her own room and then she did not. These transitions happened without announcement. The way certain things do between people who are paying attention. She did not move to Osprey permanently for another 2 years. She built her consulting practice in a way that did not require her physical presence in Toronto except for specific meetings. And Callum renovated the north end of the house, his father's old office space, which had been used for storage since 2003, into a room with good light and a proper desk and a view of the water. He did this without being asked. She noticed that he did it without being asked. The Brentworth meeting went the way Vera had said it would. They came to the mill, which was itself a departure from the previous arrangement, and they sat at a table with the forestry assessment in front of them and 2 people across from them instead of 1. The final pricing agreement was better than what Callum had accepted for 22 years. Not everything, but meaningfully better. Jerry Hessler's new rate held. The Ottawa overpayment was recovered in full through the estate of the holding company, which had been in the process of dissolving anyway. The maintenance contract on the saws was renegotiated. Callum kept the spiral notebook, not because it was useful anymore. He had a proper accounting system now, managed quarterly by a bookkeeper in Sudbury, and reviewed twice a year by Vera with the same careful attention she had given to that first night at the kitchen table. He kept the notebook because it was his father's, and because throwing it away would have felt like the wrong conclusion to draw from what it represented. What it represented was not incompetence. It was the assumption that familiarity is the same as understanding. His father had known that land intimately. Callum knew it the same way, and that knowledge was real. The assessor had confirmed it. The timber was healthy, the operation was fundamentally sound. It just had holes in it. Quiet, long-standing holes that no one had been looking for. Because looking for holes in something you love feels like a kind of disloyalty. That was the thing that took Callum the longest to work through. Not the money, though the money mattered. Not the pride, though the pride was real. It was the idea that examining the thing carefully, turning it over and looking at what didn't add up, somehow meant you didn't trust it. Vera, when he said this to her one evening in the 2nd year, said, "Examining something carefully is the opposite of not trusting it. It's what you do with things you intend to keep." He thought about that for a long time. They were married quietly in the spring, in the town hall in the nearest municipality, with 2 of Callum's mill workers and Vera's sister as witnesses. There was no particular ceremony. Vera wore a blue dress and Callum wore a jacket that had last seen use at Peter Drummond's funeral, and afterward they drove back to the lake and sat on the dock for a while in the early afternoon light. He said, "Peter would have had something to say about this," she said. "Several things probably," he said. "All of them correct," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm sorry I was difficult at the beginning." She said. "You weren't difficult, you were cautious. There's a difference." He said. "I didn't make it easy for you," she said. "No, but I didn't need it to be easy. I needed it to be honest. And you were honest eventually," he said. "Eventually," she said. "That's usually how it goes." The lake was doing its spring thing, where the ice had been gone for 2 weeks, and the surface was a particular shade of blue that doesn't exist anywhere else, and the loons had come back, and the maples along the eastern shore were just beginning to show green at the tips. Callum looked at it the way you look at something you have been looking at your whole life and are just beginning to fully see. The Strachan mill is still operating. I can tell you that. It has been through 3 good seasons since the pricing was corrected and the contracts were renegotiated. The north section hardwood was harvested selectively this past autumn. Callum's decision, timed to a market window Vera identified. And the revenue from that single cut was meaningful enough that Callum hired 2 permanent employees he had been putting off for years. What I find myself thinking about, when I think about this story, is not the money recovered or the contracts renegotiated or even the marriage, though all of those things matter. What I think about is the spiral notebook, the pencil columns. The assumption that because something has worked well enough for a long time, no examination is required. Every one of us has a version of that notebook, a system we inherited or built that we have stopped looking at, because looking at it feels like doubting it. A way of doing something that made sense when we started and that we have not checked since. A cost we keep paying because we always have. A relationship we've priced too low because we never asked what it was worth. Callum Strachan knew 800 acres of timber country better than almost any man alive. He just hadn't looked at the books in 22 years. Vera Lund didn't come to Osprey Lake to save anything. She came to understand what she had inherited. What she found was a sound operation with unexamined holes, and a man who, once he decided to look, was willing to see. That is rarer than it sounds. So I'll ask you what I always ask at the end of a story like this. What is the thing in your life that you know well, that you trust, that you have not examined in a long time? Not because you're afraid of what you'll find, but because you've never thought to look. Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.